do so far online, so, you know. I think it was like my first year here, maybe my second year here. Dr. Hawk from English was teaching English pre-mask, so I could just have my office door open all the time. And it was like the day before spring break. And the few students that were there early, he had taking bets with him as to how many people. I don't know what the prize was, but I just found it really amusing. Good morning, Zoom people. Okie dokie, it is 9, so we'll go ahead and get going. More people may trickle in, both online and in person, we shall see. So today we're going to start our lecture on everyday living. We'll finish that after break, and then we'll just have a lecture on reflections on thinking like a scientist. Our last day of class is exam 4, same format as the last couple, but short answers than exam 3. Promise. And then during our final exam time, you'll have your poster presentation. Now is a good time to think about catching up on perusals if you're behind on those. I will also do that because I'm behind on grading them. And then the other thing to be thinking about is those psychology experience credits. So hopefully y'all have been engaging in some studies. If not, you can do summaries of articles pretty easily. And we've talked about how you find stuff, and Stephen Leish showed us as well. So just let me know if you have any questions about doing that. Those are basically, as long as you follow the formula, a really easy way to get some points, basically. So just make sure you turn those in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share screen for our online folks. Do this so everybody can see. All righty. Okay, so this is chapter 9, and we're talking about psychological science and everyday living. It's a little bit of a continuation of our last chapter, which was more sort of understanding what other people do, right? This is kind of understanding more how you can apply scientific literacy and psychological literacy to your own life. So the first thing I have is just a really short video with some students talking about, sort of what they've taken away from.
My name is Mohan. I was enrolled in the Bachelor of Science Honours Psychology course at MDIS.
My name is Muhammad Umar Marikan, and I am currently pursuing the higher diploma in psychology at MDIS.
I am Abirami, and I took the Bachelor of Science Honours degree program.
I took up the full-time program. I am a full-time technician, working the night shift and a father. From my point of view, this helps me to achieve a healthy work-life balance, to work, study, and have time for my family. If I were to take up a part-time program, I am afraid that I won't be able to manage my course timetable.
I really enjoyed the clinical psychology module because it allowed me to compare different therapeutic approaches to mental illness. I also enjoyed the independent research module because it allowed me to choose an area of research that I was interested in, and it also gave me freedom to choose my own methodology, whatever I liked for that research.
It will be the most sought after profession as psychology is involved and required in some way or another in most companies and industries. And it also shows the importance of psychology as it is relevant in one way or another. Furthermore, the need for psychologists, counselors, or even social workers has increased drastically in recent times after COVID-19 as well.
So, mental health is becoming a huge priority because this has been underlined by COVID-19. There's been an explosion of mental illness during this time. And this is probably the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a lot more. We're just seeing the beginnings of this. There's also other problems like social media has negative effects. We're also seeing the breakdown of meaningful community support that causes psychological alienation. You've also got technology like AI, making people lose their jobs and also their sense of purpose. So those are all going to have effects, and psychology is going to need to evolve to address all those challenges.
Psychology is a fascinating study of the human mind, social behavior.
I mean, you guys know what psychology is the study of at this point, but just sort of thinking about all the things that psychology can be applied to, it's really true. So I might have mentioned this previously, but back when we had first year experience, FYE, which was a 1-credit class all incoming first years took, there was a common read that everybody had to do. And we did panels based on that every year during orientation. And every single year, I think maybe 1 year that I was here, we didn't have one, but like they put a psychologist on the panel. They would rotate through the other disciplines, but like psychology is really relevant to the vast majority of things in life, right? So Fortune 500 companies love psychology majors because when you take social psych, you essentially learn how to manipulate people, right? We call it like learning how to convince people. You're learning how to manipulate people, right? So you're great for marketing, your advertising. They like that y'all know how to write and read and speak. And so, it really is a major that even if you don't want to go be a therapist, you can certainly find lots of applications for. And also, if you do want to be a therapist, as I pointed out here, unfortunately, the need is only going to rise because of the fact that so many people have been so overwhelmed during COVID. I mean, when we start to actually come out, we're going to have to reckon with the fact that 750,000 Americans have died, right? No one's allowed that to process yet because we can't, because we're still in the middle of it, right? And so psychologists, therapists, social workers, like I said, will continue to be needed at great numbers. And, this is not limited to COVID. I was the assistant director of our psychological clinic, my 5th year of grad school, which meant I kind of ran all the paperwork and helped supervise and things like that. And at that time, that was 2008, 2009, we started to see an uptick in number of people. Like normally someone might have to wait a couple days, maybe a week to get seen. And it started to be like a month or more, which is really unusual when you have a clinic full of student therapists waiting to get client hours, right? So this isn't new, unfortunately. We're living in really difficult times. That was right before the housing bubble burst. So, economically, things are going to bother people, socially, health-wise. So it's a good field to go in, and it's also a good field to have to sort of help you think through issues in your life, etc. One of the things that your chapter talks about is explanatory style, which is the way that we explain our behavior and the events we experience. So psychology can help give us perspective on the things we tell ourselves, right, essentially. So, and the dimensions here there are threefold. The first one is internal versus external. So are you attributing it to something you have control over, or external, something you don't have any control over? Then there's stable or unstable. Do you see this as something that's unchanging? You couldn't do anything to fix it? Or do you see it as this is kind of a fluke, this is due to something just going on right now and it's going to change? And then global versus particular, or sometimes you'll see this as global versus specific. Global would be, this is going to apply to every situation ever, right? And particular or specific is, it's just applying to this particular situation right now. So this is a chart, I believe, from my abnormal psychology book. I've used it in so many different PowerPoints now that I don't remember the original source. I should have it on there. But that kind of gives you an idea of how these different explanatory styles might work. So let's say you take a test in one of your psych classes and you fail it, right? So if you have an internal, so it's on me, stable, this isn't going to change over time, global, this is going to apply in every situation, you might say, I have a problem with test anxiety. It hits me every test, and maybe that motivates you to go do something about it, or maybe you think, there's nothing I can do about it, it's always going to be this way, right? I'm always going to bomb all my tests. You can have internal, stable, and specific, where you say, I just don't get psychology. It's the field. And I don't know if psych is the most common one. I think a lot of people will do this for like math or the hard sciences. Some people will have it for like English, for example. For me, it was chemistry. When I got to Orgo, I was like, I don't know what's happening. But yeah, I was able to find my home in psychology. So you can have an internal, global, but unstable, and say, getting into an argument with my roommate threw off my whole day. So it was something about me, but it applied to the whole situation, and it's kind of a one-off. It can be specific. I got upset and froze when I couldn't answer the first two questions. Yeah, that can happen, right? You don't know the first couple multiple choice questions, you think, I'm not going to know all the rest of it, right? And even if you don't normally have test anxiety, that can be almost crippling in the moment. Then you can see how this starts to shift. So if you have external, stable, and global, you just hate written tests. Written tests are the worst way, they're unfair. You're never going to get something accurate off written tests. You can have that be more specific. Everyone knows that Dr. Myers enjoys giving unfair tests. I don't actually, but there are those professors, right, who maybe seem to, right, like seem to delight in giving tests that everyone fails. This happened to be, again, I'm going to keep bringing it up, in organic chemistry. Our professor purposely wrote the test so that the average was a 27 out of 50. As someone who didn't fail things, that was really hard. But luckily he made the average a B, so I ended up with a B in the class. Don't know that I had B level knowledge, right? So unstable, external, and global. So no one does well on tests that are given the day after vacation. So if I were to give you all tests, a week from today, this could be your solution. And you can have external, unstable, specific. This professor didn't put much thought into the test because the pressure of her book deadline. The professor, she's got a submission date coming up. Now, your book talks about the pessimistic and the optimistic styles. I think these are ones that we tend to use pretty broadly, almost like a personality trait, right, in our understanding of things in overall society. So for pessimistic, you tend to use external It's on the world around me, specific and unstable ideas, but for positive events. So you're just like, well, of course that happened in this situation, X, Y, Z, right? And then optimistic people do the exact same thing, but for negative events. Oh, that was a fluke, right? That will happen again, right? And so neither of these is necessarily always accurate, but at the same time, neither of these is necessarily always inaccurate. And so the depressive style is something that we see and talk about in therapy. And it tends to be internal, global, and stable. And so for someone who's depressed, it might just be, rather than, oh, I have test anxiety, it might be, well, I failed this exam because I'm stupid, right? Even if there's someone who got a really good SAT score, maybe it's been IQ tested and has a good IQ, right? But the depression essentially makes them believe they're just bad at everything. So different ways of these things interacting and you using these lenses to interpret things can really change how you feel and how you behave in reaction, right? So like, something like getting upset and freezing, you might say, okay, let me think of techniques I can use if that happens again, right? Maybe I learn some breathing techniques, or I flip to the back of the exam and start there. If you're saying something like external, stable, global, you're probably not going to change much, right? You're going to be like, well, there's nothing I can do about that. Written tests are always going to suck, right? So you can see how these styles can really influence things, like how well you're going to interpret things, and how that's going to affect you, right? That's the biggest piece of this. All right, so we have a brief video. Thought it was really interesting that this is a video created by the t-shirt company Life is Good. So hashtag ad, it's not sponsored, so I'm not getting any money. But just they're talking to people being an optimist or a pessimist and why.
We're in New York City in Union Square.
And we're just out in the streets here finding out if people are optimists or pessimists. How are you folks doing?
Do I have to catch anything?
No. Would you say that you're an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, it certainly depends on the day. I've never taken that question seriously.
I would say I'm an optimist,
An
for
optimist.
sure. I would say I'm a pessimist, yeah.
Okay. How do you think that affects your day-to-day life?
I think it slows me down a little bit.
I'm an optimist.
You're an optimist.
Definitely an optimist.
And why would you say that?
But just look around you.
It's beautiful out.
Yeah.
You know, not a cloud. There's hardly a cloud in the sky.
I'm alive. I'm here with you guys.
Yeah.
Can you think of one time when it was harder to be an optimist?
Jeez.
Last semester I was doing a bio class, biology, right? And first two tests I completely failed.
I lost both of my parents at a very young age.
My life was headed in the wrong direction. A lot of depression. I've been in a wheelchair for 19 years, so.
Maybe every time I was scraping by, wondering what I was going to eat for next meal.
So I slept on the floor on a towel for like 3 weeks, and then was like saving up to buy a bed, but it got better.
There's always something good to look forward to. No matter what situation you're in.
When you get that meal, there you go. It doesn't have to be that you win the lottery. Something small is still that much important.
My life experience showed me that being a pessimist and being desperate brings to nothing.
And there are definitely days where I have to remind myself, like, take advantage of your time here.
My wife had cancer and I took care of her for 5 years. We used to travel with her cancer, and the reason was because we always thought that it's going to be better. Of course, cancer could kill, and it killed her, but we enjoyed life to the fullest.
Bad situations, they might seem like bad situations because of what I was taught.
That's a really good time to sort of try to flip it and think about what you've got to be grateful for.
but like at least I have, you know, my sight, my feelings, my hearing.
Now I'm working as a software developer. You know, I went from just, you know, scraping by to where I am now.
I have a 98-year-old grandmother who's an eternal optimist.
Yeah.
I think it's how she's stayed healthy and happy.
That's what's good about being an optimist is you can always look ahead. Enjoy the present as opposed to lamenting it. And if you don't like your present, change your present. That's why it's the future.
Thank you so much for watching that video.
We are exactly the type of people I anticipated running that company. It's just good surfer bros. So yeah, and so clearly they're skewed towards the optimism side of things. But really what psychology tells us is just like always being an optimist or always being a pessimist isn't necessarily healthy, right? Like there are times you have to fully acknowledge like this sucks right now, right? And that can be really important.
We're in New York.
So that's sort of the caveat here, right? The unrealistic optimism can be problematic. This is like the belief you'll experience more positive outcomes in life compared to others, even in the absence of objective reasons for such belief. So that can go back to some of the things we've recently talked about in terms of how most people tend to rate themselves above average on things, right? On everything. And like everyone can't be above average just statistically. That's not how it works, right? It also can potentially lead to you being unprepared, right, for things that come your way. If you're like, oh, it'll just all work out. It makes me think a little bit of the old joke. It's like there's someone in a hurricane, they're on top of their house roof, right? And someone comes by in a boat and they say, come on, get in. They're like, no, the Lord will provide. And then, I don't know, a helicopter comes. Oh, no, the Lord will provide. And then they drown and they get to heaven and they're like, what happened? And God was like, I provided a boat and a helicopter, right? So like, sometimes you need that realistic perspective, right? To be able to figure these things out. The Pollyanna principle is an outlook on life characterized by unrelenting optimism regarding the future and an unwillingness to accept failure. So again, this can be potentially really motivating, right? Like they were saying, like, oh, you don't like your now, change it, right? But again, it can also be potentially problematic if this becomes a pathological denial. Right? Like nothing ever goes wrong. It does, and then we figure it out, right? So they talk about Seligman here, which I really like. So Seligman, I've actually heard talk at APA. He's a really interesting guy. He did stuff on learned helplessness. So if you remember back to IntroPsych, or if you've taken some of the biopsych type classes, you might have talked about this. He did these experiments. They're kind of horrible when you think about them. The dogs weren't actually harmed. I'm going to say that going forward. He did these experiments where you would have a cage, and then there'd be like this little half wall. And okay, those of you who've had me before know I cannot draw. So this dog is going to be a very abstract dog. It's such a dog. Okay. Maybe I gave a smile. That'll help. Okay. And essentially they'd apply a light electric shock, not enough to harm the dog, but enough to certainly be annoying, maybe even a little bit painful, right? And for half the dogs, they could just hop over the wall and get to this other side. Now, for the other half of the dogs, he built this wall up so they couldn't get out. And what he found is these dogs would eventually just sort of like lay down in the corner until the shock was done, because they're like, there's nothing I can do. Even to the point where if he got rid of that wall and they could hop over, they didn't. Because he called it learned helplessness. They had learned there was nothing they could do, and so they didn't try to do anything about it. So based on this and other studies he did, and I mean, just he's hilarious. Like he told us about how, I forget the title of it. I probably should remember because the story is so good. Like he has a theory now about sort of like radical optimism or positivity. And he was like, I came up with the term when I was coming out of anesthesia after surgery. And I'm like, oh boy, Sullivan, oh boy. But so he was certainly looking at pessimistic styles, and he talked about events, or what he would call adverse events or activating events, beliefs, your interpretation of that event, and then the consequence of those beliefs. And we're going to go through an example of that in a minute that'll hopefully make that make more sense. And so then he said, well, then what we can do is start to pick that apart. Why are we believing that about this particular scenario? So he said beliefs can be true or not. Sometimes we just have the wrong idea. Sometimes, whatever pathology we're experiencing is essentially getting us to lie to ourselves. And so we talked about other scientists using a similar approach. And yeah, we'll just go right to this, because this will make this make more sense. Let me actually get the eraser, so I'm not just rubbing it all over my hands. There we go. All right, and do this so that hopefully our Zoom friends can see it a little. Okay. So this is the ABC, and this was adapted for therapy by Albert Ellis, who came up with a type of therapy called rational emotive therapy. He later called it rational emotive behavioral therapy, because he said behaviors were always a part of it. And it became sort of trendy to include behavioral in the name of your therapy. So your A is your activating or adverse. Your B is your belief. And then the C is the consequences. And so the classic example we use for this, and we would use a sheet exactly like this in therapy with clients. And when we're explaining this to them, the classic example that we use is, say you're walking and you see someone you know, let's say a friend, and you say hi, and they ignore you. So imagine walking down the middle of campus, you see someone, hey, how's it going? But they just go. Right? Okay. So a lot of people think, well, because of that, I had these consequences, right? I felt crappy the rest of the day. But what Seligman said, what Ellis further expanded, and what other cognitive and rational emotive and dialectical behavioral therapists talk about is it really is our beliefs about that scenario that lead to the consequences. So what are some beliefs, some reactions, internal reactions you could have to this scenario? Right, yeah. And how would you feel, and what might you do if you thought a friend was mad at you? Yeah, upset, maybe mad back, right? And maybe you don't talk to them. Oh, that's really funny, sorry. What's another reaction you could have internally? Yeah. What did I do? And how would that make you feel? Anxious? Yeah, perplexed, anxious. So you might spend the whole rest of the day what we call ruminating, where you're just thinking about over and over and over, what did I do? What did I do? What did I do? Right? Racking your brain. What's another explanation you could have? You are there. Yeah. So maybe my friend is having a bad day. And what would be the consequences of you thinking that? Yeah, you feel bad for them, maybe approach them, right? And then one that you could have is just, maybe they didn't see. And then the answer I usually get from students on this one is like, you just feel like meh. Right? The last one I'll say, which I'm glad no one immediately went to in here, is if you are someone with this depressive style, what you actually might have done, and actually I'm just gonna stop share for a minute just so my screen will be a little bigger for the people watching remotely. If you had a depressive style, you might think something like, well, why would they want to be my friend anyway? Or like, I'm a horrible person. Right. And if you thought of that in that scenario, what might the consequences be? How would you feel? How would you act? Yeah, moody. Yeah. And so Seligman's idea, which again has been translated into most of the empirically supported therapies today, is that essentially it's not the event, it's how we're interpreting it that leads to the consequences. And for people with certain disorders, actually people with most disorders, it's not that they're hearing voices, right? They're just telling themselves these things. And most of the time it's automatic. They don't even realize they're doing this to themselves, right? And if you can intervene here, if you can get them to start to question that. So let me reshare here. The ABC sheet has some nice examples here. So asking yourself, are my thoughts about B realistic? Right? So if you just say, I'm a horrible person, that's why they didn't say hi. You know, you can question like, well, have they said hi to me in the past? Oh yeah, right? So it's not global, right? We're thinking about an attribution. And then you can ask yourself, what can you tell yourself in the future? And maybe you get to one of these other ones, like maybe they didn't see me, or maybe my friend's having a bad day. Maybe instead of brooding about it, I should just go ask them, right? I think it's like, I don't know how many other people watch romantic comedies, but they're my escapism. And I always feel like everything in romantic comedies would be totally solved if people just talk to each other, right? And I think that some of that trickles over into day-to-day life, right? If we just talked to each other about what was going on, then maybe we wouldn't have so many issues sometimes, right? Oh yeah, Just like, go talk to them. But sometimes that's hard and sometimes that's scary, right? And we've kind of been conditioned, you don't do that. Especially, let's say romance is supposed to have some mystery, or depending on our cultural upbringing, we may have been trained like you don't pry into other people's lives, right? So that can be a big piece of this as well. So now you start to see how not only can this be something you apply to your own life, but this can be applied in the therapy room, and this can start to help people who are really struggling, right? It seems so simple, but I have seen this process, and you have people do it in session with you, you have people do it for homework between sessions, and it can really start to be eye-opening for those people and really, really work for them. And not just depression, eating disorders, PTSD, a bunch of things, generalized anxiety, a bunch of things I've worked with. All right, so then your book talks about health behaviors, and rather than just sort of like list some. I wanted to know what health behaviors can you think of that psychologists may be able to help individuals yet. So behaviors that would help people improve their health that maybe they're not engaging in for some reason or another. How could psychology come in, apply some skills, and help those people better their lives? Yeah. Yeah, huge one, right? So that can help not only for mental health, but even something as simple as like keeping track of whether or not you exercise that day or something like that, if that's one of your goals.
Showering regularly, keeping your face clean, like the things that kind of go up first when people are running.
Yeah, definitely. Let's think about physical health as well. What ways could a psychologist help someone struggling with physical health issues? Yes, very good example. Yeah, so there's a whole, well, first of all, there's a subfield of clinical psychology called health psychology, and there's a subfield of that called pain management or chronic pain. And yeah, you do things like meditations, deep breathing, and some of this type of stuff to figure out what's going on when they're feeling pain and there's not actually a physical cause. Because a lot of times stress gets wrapped up in that, and it can make it difficult for our bodies to let go of that pain. Yeah. What about habits? Let's think about some bad habits people have that can negatively affect their lives. Drugs and alcohol. Yep. Yeah, you can use techniques like motivational interviewing, where you try to talk to the person about like, what role is this substance playing in your life? Is it helping you get to the life that you want, right? And what would need to change and why would you want to change it? So to give you an example, I worked with some morbidly obese individuals when I was on my placement in grad school, working up pre-surgical evaluations for bariatric surgery. And a lot of them said the reason they were doing this was because they wanted to be able to like see their kids or their grandkids grow up, right? And play with them, see them graduate. And so that's a huge motivator, right? That's huge. Smoking cessation is another example. Oh, looks like we've got some stuff in the chat. Yeah, routine building, exercise, yeah. And all of this you could use, you know, goal setting, things along those lines. Yeah, so what health behaviors do you think people are most likely to avoid and why? I know for me it's exercise. I just like, I can't figure out how to fit it in my day this semester, and it's really annoying to me because I was doing really well in previous semesters, and it just makes me feel better mentally as well, right? But this semester just hasn't worked, and I'm like, it'll be so much better when I can incorporate it. I just know. So. Yeah, so sometimes just those small behaviors related to hygiene or self-care, right, can make a difference. But yeah, but like we could like talk ourselves out of them, right? Yeah, I mean, people avoid things like, I mean, some of these get really scary, right? Where people will avoid going to the doctor, right? Because they're scared. Let's say they might get a cancer diagnosis, or, you know, they won't take an HIV test because they're afraid it would pop positive, right? Well, that's not actually helping anything, right? By avoiding it. And so what we need to do is, again, motivate them, work with them about going to those appointments, getting those screenings, things along those lines. And we've kind of already covered 3 in our discussion here. All right, so this is from the American Psychological Association, and it's talking about how health psychologists do this, what skills they use to help people engage in these.
I'm Dr. Deborah Tate, and I'm a health psychologist. You get into psychology, or at least I did, because I wanted to help people. I've moved a little bit away from doing that one-on-one to public health, where we try to develop programs that can help lots more people change and live healthier lives. We use science to understand which of the things we're trying is most effective. What's amazing is that the top leading causes of death are actually preventable. Things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all those kinds of chronic illnesses are preventable or treatable if we could help people to lead a healthier lifestyle. In psychology, we apply the same principles of basic science to do an experiment. We develop some research questions or hypotheses, and then we develop an intervention and apply an experimental design where you rigorously control for factors. I study two things: strategies for improving weight loss and how we can use technology to adapt face-to-face programs that are proven to be effective, put them online, and get them out to more people. Young adults in the US are...
Give a quick caveat too, that's where a lot of psych science is right now, even before the pandemic, but as you can imagine, the pandemic really pushed us to try to get more of it accessible online.
Gaining on average 30 pounds between the time they're 18 and 35. Young adults are also starting to have cardiovascular disease markers or risk factors like higher blood pressure and cholesterol problems earlier than prior generations. We follow them with technology. So we're using websites, cell phones, mobile web, or texting to have them keep tabs on their weight. And there's a program behind the scenes that gives them suggestions or gives them feedback. Then we have a lot of data. And so we try to put all that together and unpack what happened and tell a story, not only on whether it worked or didn't work, but how it worked. It's fun because
that scene is exactly like the fact that I used of semen earlier in the semester, like a lot of fake science. It's just staring at a computer.
you get to ask questions and then see whether your predictions are right or wrong, and you get to think about puzzles and complex relationships. And what's more interesting than humans and behavior and all those things that are part of what we are, but also can be applied to major real-world problems like health.
And one thing I'll say here, I think we kind of get the gist from this video, is just writing a friend of mine about this morning. There's a lot of, and I recognize that her research is on health, weight loss, and a lot of people really focus on that, but there's a lot of research now that suggests that it isn't actually weight gain in isolation that causes things like cardiovascular disease or diabetes. It's actually the weight cycling. So what's called yo-yo dieting. So you gain, you lose, you might gain more back and you lose. That's really not good for your body. Your body can't take that stress of gaining and losing. And so they've actually looked at, say, a group of overweight people who have never dieted versus a group of overweight people who do this yo-yo dieting. And the people who have never dieted don't have these same health problems that were just like attributing to obesity. So I think more modern approaches, this video is a few years old, are going to incorporate more of that. Like, let's not try to diet, right? Let's talk about making healthy choices. I could go on a whole rant about that because that's like an ancillary to my research that I look into. All right, the next one is about sort of determinants of health.
Health. It's the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And good health is something we strive to achieve, not just individually, but also as a community. But if we look around us, our family, friends, and others, we know that health is very variable. For example, in 2016, the life expectancy of a child born in Sierra Leone was 53 years, while in Australia, it was 83 years. But even within Australia, the life expectancy of Indigenous people is about 10 years lower than that of non-Indigenous people. And even within a specific group of people, health can change based on a person's income, level of education, or occupation. So why is health so variable? To answer that question, we must understand the factors that influence health. The factors that influence a person's health are called determinants of health. These include who they are, such as age, sex, and genetic makeup, and what they do, as in health behaviors such as smoking, physical activity, alcohol use, and diet. Health is also largely influenced by the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, collectively called the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health.
So these are a lot of what psychologists try to help with, right? Are these psychosociological factors. And there's a lot of psychologists, social psychologists, health psychologists, who are trying to really work to make systematic changes, because there's only so much of this you can intervene with at the individual level, right?
Are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at an international, national, and local level. These can lead to health inequities, which is the difference in health between different groups of people that is unfair and avoidable. Let's take a look at the social determinants of health using a framework developed by the World Health Organization. According to this framework, there are two broad groups of health determinants: structural and intermediary. Structural determinants are the socio-economic and political context that people live in. It includes governance, economic, social, and public policies, and also the social and cultural values placed on health issues. These factors can lead to the unequal distribution of material and monetary resources, which can shape a person's socioeconomic position. Socioeconomic position is characterized by education, occupation, income, gender, race or ethnicity, and social class. The structural determinants of health operate through a set of intermediary determinants that impact a person's exposure, vulnerability, and outcomes to factors affecting their health. These include material circumstances, such as the quality of housing, the financial means to buy healthy food, clothing, or other requirements for healthy living, and work environment. Psychosocial factors, like stressful living circumstances, relationships, and social support. Behavioral and biological factors. In addition to these, health systems determine the type of healthcare, the quality of it, and how easily accessible it is. Bridging the structural and intermediary determinants are social cohesion and social capital. The links between all these determinants are not always linear, but can be complex, interdependent, and interact in many different ways to influence health. For example, poor income can limit opportunities for achieving good health, and conversely, poor health can limit opportunities for people to participate in the workforce. And remember, these determinants can act across the course of a person's life. So, the next time you think about a health issue, consider not.
So the example I always give is, let's say you have the genetic propensity to be 6'4", right? But growing up, you don't have access to adequate nutrition. You're always going hungry. You might not ever reach that genetic potential for your height, right, based on the environment. So yes, psychologists are really trying to get people to realize this is what's going on. Sociologists are here too. Dr. Stoley does a lot of health sociology work, which is brilliant. And, thinking about the ways this is approached in the US in particular, they're talking about Australia and having some health inequities, but they have national healthcare, right? We have people who just literally can't access it, right? So the antidote here is that essentially no one arrives at any learning opportunity or decision point with a total lack of knowledge. We all have some previous information. And so we need to be aware of the knowledge people are coming in with. So this email, or actually this Facebook message I was sending to a friend of mine who's a DO today, he did not believe me when I was expressing to him the idea that part of the obesity health corollary is socially determined, right? It's determined by bias in medicine. So for example, I think I told you all about the H1N1 study, how they show that's based on H1N1 data from 2009, I think that's when that happened. They decided people who are obese are at higher risk, and then they applied that forward to COVID. Well, some social scientists took that data and looked at it and looked at time from seeing a doctor to getting adequate care for H1N1 and found that was longer for people who were obese. And if you entered that into the equation, that relationship between obesity and poorer outcomes with H1N1 was totally explained. So we know that there's a lot of weight bias in medicine, right? And again, this is not every doctor, but it's sort of built into the medical system, right? They're taught that obesity causes these things. And, you know, when you're in med school, you're just memorizing a bunch of stuff. You don't necessarily have time to stop and nuance, right? And so it can be really hard for doctors to be like, what do you mean obesity is not just causing these things? And it's like, well, it's not. There's other stuff going on too, right? Right, exactly. My favorite I've ever seen for this is there was a cartoon of like a person with literally like a stake going through them, like a giant hole, and the doctor being like, maybe you should lose some weight, right? Like it's an extreme, but that's always the solution for people. Like there are evidence from research showing that they have delayed cancer screenings and things along those lines, but doctors just don't do them on obese people. You have to be aware of these pre-concepts, these pre-existing ideas and beliefs that a person's going to bring to that situation, which may conflict with a scientific understanding of the situation. Again, even for people steeped in science, because they might not be considering the more recent research, the behavioral science aspects of things as well. So people will still behave in ways that are harmful to their health. Part of it is coping, right? Things like smoking, alcohol use, drug use, right? They activate neurotransmitters in our minds that make us feel better, right? And so they talk about to get people motivated for health-related behaviors, you give them education, you have them self-monitor, so something even just like as simple as a Fitbit for activity can be a way to go. And you can have them do like positive imagery. And in fact, positive imagery is being used in a lot of sports psychology for professional athletes as well. And so self-control and thinking these things through is associated with fewer physical health symptoms, but also mental health symptoms. It's not a perfect solution, obviously, but it starts to get us there. All righty, well, if I won't see you, have a happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate it. You know, if nothing else, just enjoy your time off, relax, hopefully. And folks online, same to you, happy Thanksgiving.